She moved through the corridor with the quiet assurance of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere, carrying a polished tray that reflected the cool lights like a thin moon, and Elias watched without meaning to, feeling the hum of the palace through his boots as the station rotated, feeling the ache of distance from home settle behind his eyes. Her hair fell pale and long, gathered in twin ties that framed a face too composed for a servant, yet the uniform fit her perfectly, silver fabric seamless and clean, gloves pristine, posture precise, and every step placed as if measured by an unseen cadence. Elias had been warned that the court favored tests and masks, that nothing here was as it seemed, but the warnings felt abstract until the woman paused near the viewport, the stars spilling past like cold sparks, and glanced back with eyes that weighed more than rank. He told himself not to stare, that a human consort invited curiosity and danger in equal measure, that attention was a currency he could not afford to spend on passing figures, yet something in her stillness tugged at him, a gravity deeper than protocol. The corridor smelled faintly of iron polish and spice from distant kitchens, and the lights dimmed a fraction as the palace shifted modes, a signal of a ceremonial hour approaching, a reminder that the Empress would soon appear to judge petitions and promises. Elias breathed out, steadying himself, recalling the vows he had made to represent humanity with patience and care, to be present without being consumed, to listen more than he spoke, and to trust the quiet compass inside him. When the woman turned away and continued, the moment lingered like an afterimage, and he wondered why the echo of her presence felt like recognition rather than novelty. The audience chamber opened ahead, a vast arc of glass and living metal, where envoys murmured and attendants flowed like water, and Elias took his place near the human delegation, feeling both conspicuous and oddly protected by the insignia at his collar. He remembered his first arrival, the way the palace had seemed alive, corridors breathing, walls shifting their textures in response to mood and purpose, a civilization so old it had learned to speak softly. The Empress had been distant then, a figure of light and authority, her voice resonant, her gaze sharp, and yet when she had named him consort, there had been no triumph in her tone, only a careful curiosity that had unsettled him. Now the chamber hushed, the floor brightened in a path of pale gold, and attendants aligned with practiced grace, including the silver-clad woman, who took a position near the dais, tray balanced, expression neutral. Elias felt the air change, a pressure like weather, as the Empress arrived without fanfare, her presence unfolding rather than entering, and the court bowed in unison. From his angle, Elias could see the Empress only in reflection at first, a towering silhouette softened by light, and then directly, a being of poise and command whose features echoed the servants in ways that made his pulse quicken. The resemblance was subtle enough to dismiss as coincidence, yet his instincts stirred, the same quiet compass twitching, and he found himself watching the servant instead of the throne. Petitions began, voices rising and falling, translators humming, and Elias answered when addressed, careful with words, attentive to nuance, offering human perspectives shaped by scarcity and cooperation. Between exchanges, his gaze drifted, not out of distraction but alignment, tracking the servant's movements, the way she anticipated needs before they were voiced, the way her shoulders squared when tension rippled through the room. Once, their eyes met, and the contact held a fraction longer than chance allowed, her expression unchanged, yet something passed, an acknowledgement like a shared memory not yet lived. Elias felt a warmth at his sternum, a recognition he could not name, and he thought of his grandmother's stories about knowing someone by the way silence behaved around them. The Empress spoke then, her voice cutting cleanly through the chamber, posing a question about loyalty and truth, and the room leaned forward, breath held. Elias answered plainly, speaking of trust built through listening, of tests that revealed more about the tester than the tested, of the danger of mistaking obedience for understanding. As he spoke, he sensed approval ripple not only from the throne but from the margins, and when he finished, the servant's lips curved almost imperceptibly, as if in relief. The session ended, courtiers dispersed, and Elias lingered, absorbing the quiet that followed ceremony, when the palace seemed to exhale. He found himself near the refreshment alcove, where the silver-clad woman approached with her tray, offering a cup whose steam carried a familiar herbal note, one he had shared with the Empress during a rare private moment. He accepted, their fingers nearly touching, and the contact sent a calm certainty through him, a sense of being seen without scrutiny. "Thank you," he said, keeping his voice gentle, and she inclined her head with a grace that felt personal rather than practiced. "You listen well," she replied softly, and the words carried weight, as if they were both observation and invitation. Elias met her gaze, choosing honesty over caution, and said, "So do you, aware of the risk, aware of the truth humming beneath the exchange." For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space between them, and then footsteps approached, breaking the spell, and she stepped back, mask restored. Later, alone in his quarters, Elias replayed the day, tracing the thread of intuition that had guided him, weighing the resemblance he could not unsee. He considered the palace's reputation for layered tests, for truths revealed through patience rather than confrontation, and he smiled to himself, not with smugness but with quiet resolve. He had not come to this place to conquer or to submit, but to meet another mind with openness, to build a bridge strong enough to hold difference. If he was being tested, then the measure would be empathy, not acuity, and he trusted that more than any formal proof. Outside his window, the stars wheeled, and the palace lights shifted to a nocturne palette, signaling rest cycles across the station. Elias set his cup aside, feeling a calm anticipation settle, like the pause before a conversation that would change everything. He did not yet know how the mask would fall, only that when it did, he would recognize the soul behind it. The night cycle deepened, and Elias woke to the palace breathing around him, a subtle vibration through the walls that felt like a living thing adjusting its stance, and he lay still, letting intuition settle before thought. He dressed slowly, choosing the simple human cut he favored for private meetings, fabric that reminded him of gravity and weather and hands that built rather than commanded. When the summons arrived, it came without seal or escort, a soft illumination along the floor leading him inward, toward quieter corridors where echoes thinned and meaning thickened. He followed, aware of cameras that watched without intruding, of sentinels that listened for tone rather than threat, and of a test that continued even in silence. At a junction where glass met living alloy, the silver-clad servant waited, posture relaxed, eyes clear, as if she had always been there. She inclined her head, not a bow, not a challenge, and turned, trusting him to follow, which he did without question. The corridor curved, lights dimming to a cool glow, and Elias felt the palace shift to accommodate a private truth. They entered a chamber smaller than the audience hall, intimate in scale, walls textured to absorb sound, a table set with 2 cups and a low flame that cast gentle shadows. She set the tray down and removed her gloves with deliberate care, revealing hands unmarked by labor yet practiced in precision, and Elias noted the choice with quiet respect. "Sit," she said, and the word carried warmth rather than command, a difference he felt more than heard. He took the seat opposite her, meeting her gaze openly, allowing the compass inside him to steady his breath. For a moment, neither spoke, and the silence held, shaped by trust rather than tension, a rare thing in a court built on spectacle. "I wanted to see if you would come," she said at last, and he smiled faintly, recognizing the honesty beneath the phrasing. "I wanted to see if you would ask," he replied, and the corners of her eyes softened. She studied him then, not as an empress or a servant, but as a mind meeting another across difference, measuring not worth but resonance. "You saw me," she said, not accusing, not proud, simply curious, and he nodded, choosing truth without flourish. "Not the mask," he answered. "The pause behind it, the way you listened before speaking, the way the room adjusted around you." Her breath caught, just enough to notice, and the flame between them flickered as if responding to a shift in air. "This palace is built to test," she said, "to reveal who seeks power and who seeks understanding, and you confound it." He considered that, fingers resting on the table, feeling the warmth seep into his skin, grounding him. "Tests reveal intent," he said, "but they also reveal fear, and fear hides more than it shows." She leaned back, the silver fabric catching light like liquid metal, and for the first time, she allowed weariness to show. "My people have ruled by clarity," she said, "by certainty enforced through ritual, and yet certainty can calcify into blindness." Elias listened, not interrupting, letting her set the pace, the way he had learned to do in rooms where stakes outweighed words. "When I named you Consort," she continued, "it was to bridge worlds, but also to see if humanity's reputation for empathy was earned." He met her gaze, feeling the weight of representation without resentment, understanding the necessity of proof in a universe shaped by betrayal. Empathy isn't a trait, he said. It's a practice, and practices require risk. She smiled then, fully, and the chamber seemed to brighten in response. The air shimmered, and the silver uniform flowed, reforming with a sound like distant rain, revealing regalia beneath, lines of light tracing authority along her shoulders and crown. Elias did not gasp or bow. He simply inclined his head, acknowledging the truth made visible, and her eyes searched his face for change. "Your soul didn't shift," she observed, relief threading her voice, and he felt the moment settle into something solid. "Neither did yours," he replied, and the words felt like a promise kept rather than made. She rose, moving with the same grace he had noticed before, now unmasked yet familiar, and came to stand beside him rather than across. "This was not only a test of you," she said, "but of me, to see if I could be known without diminishing my station." He stood with her, shoulder to shoulder, feeling the palace recalibrate around a truth it had anticipated. They spoke then of worlds and customs, of human cities built from scarcity and cooperation, of her people's long memory and cautious governance. Elias shared stories of engineers who listened to machines as if they were alive, of diplomats who won peace by understanding loss, of families who held together through listening. She listened with the same attention she had given the court, and he saw how her authority drew strength from curiosity rather than dominance. A tremor passed through the station, distant, contained, and her posture shifted subtly, alert without alarm. "An outer relay has failed," she said, eyes narrowing, mind already mapping consequences, and Elias felt the familiar pull of problem-solving. "May I?" he asked, and she nodded, granting access without hesitation. They moved together, a shared stride born of trust, toward the control nexus. The relay failure revealed itself as a cascade risk, one system compensating for another, efficiency spiraling toward brittleness, a flaw humans knew too well. Elias traced the pattern quickly, fingers moving through interfaces that adapted to his touch, translating intent across species design. "Your safeguards assume perfect compliance," he said, "but real systems breathe, they need slack." She watched him work, absorbing the principle, issuing calm directives that rippled outward, stabilizing nodes without panic. Together they introduced variance, small allowances that absorbed shock, and the tremor subsided into a steady hum. The chamber exhaled, lights returning to their nocturne rhythm, and Elias felt a familiar satisfaction, the quiet joy of repair. She regarded him with something like wonder, not for the fix, but for the philosophy beneath it. "When you act," she said, "you do not seek credit," and he shrugged, feeling the truth of it without false modesty. "Credit distorts incentives," he replied, "understanding sustains them." She considered that, filing it away with 1,000 other insights that would shape policy and posture in the years ahead. The palace signaled completion, and the urgency dissolved, leaving them in a space made intimate by shared effort. She reached out, not touching, but close enough that warmth passed between them, a gesture of respect in her culture. "Stay," she said, and the word carried choice rather than command, an invitation to continue building something fragile and strong. He stayed, knowing the test had become a partnership. The relay stabilized fully as dawn cycle light crept along the palace ribs, and Elias felt the aftercurrent of shared focus linger between them, a quiet alignment that neither hurried to name. They walked back through corridors that now seemed less watchful, as if the structure itself had registered a new pattern and chosen to remember it. Servants and envoys passed with respectful distance, sensing a shift without understanding its shape, and Elias noticed how the Empress adjusted her pace to his without effort. It struck him then that power could learn to match rather than overwhelm, and the thought settled warmly in his chest. She spoke of governance as stewardship, of listening as infrastructure, of how a ruler could become a bottleneck if certainty hardened too early. He responded with stories of teams that failed forward, of bridges rebuilt stronger after collapse, of resilience as an ethic rather than a tactic. Their words braided, neither leading nor following, and the palace light softened as if approving the cadence. They reached a garden atrium where bioluminescent flora traced constellations across leaves, and the air carried a mineral sweetness that reminded Elias of rain on stone. Here, she paused, allowing the mask of ceremony to thin, revealing the fatigue beneath authority, the cost of constant vigilance. "I wanted to know if humanity's empathy was myth," she said quietly, "or method," and the admission felt like a door opening. He considered his reply carefully, aware that honesty could wound as easily as it healed. "Empathy becomes method when it's practiced under pressure," he said, "when the cost is real and still chosen." She nodded, absorbing the distinction, and the light from the plants reflected softly along the lines of her crown. In that moment, Elias sensed a broader test unfolding, one that would reshape more than a relationship. The palace chimed a priority signal, not loud, but insistent, and the Empress's posture sharpened, attention dividing without fracture. A border envoy reported unrest along a trade corridor, a coalition misreading silence as weakness, probing with tariffs and patrols. Elias listened, mapping incentives and fears, seeing the familiar spiral toward escalation that humans had learned to interrupt the hard way. "May I speak?" he asked, not assuming authority, and she granted it with a glance that carried trust. He suggested a pause framed as generosity, an invitation to joint inspection rather than unilateral display, creating space for dignity to survive. The envoy hesitated, then acknowledged the wisdom, and the line went quiet as orders propagated outward. Elias felt the palace recalibrate again, as if learning a new reflex. Later, in a council chamber warmed by shared effort, dissent surfaced, subtle but present, among those who prized clarity over nuance. Questions arose about precedent, about a consort's influence, about softness mistaken for surrender, and Elias felt the weight of representation settle again. He did not defend himself. Instead, he articulated principles, not outcomes, explaining how trust compounded while coercion depleted. The Empress listened without interruption, then spoke of sovereignty as adaptive strength, of the courage required to be legible rather than feared. Her words reframed the debate, shifting it from control to continuity, and resistance softened into consideration. Elias watched the room change, sensing how leadership could model learning without losing legitimacy. The session ended with no proclamations, only alignment, and sometimes that was enough. As the palace moved toward rest, Elias returned to the garden alone, needing stillness to integrate the day's revelations. He traced the glow of leaves with his eyes, thinking of Earth nights and the way constellations anchored stories across generations. Footsteps approached, unhurried, and the Empress joined him without ceremony, her presence companionable rather than commanding. "You recognized me without unmasking," she said, curiosity resurfacing. "How did you know?" He considered the question, searching for language that would not trivialize intuition. "Because you listened before acting," he said, "because you adjusted rooms instead of filling them." She smiled, understanding the compliment as a mirror held up rather than praise bestowed. They spoke of souls as patterns, not essences, of how choices left residues that attentive minds could read. She shared how her people trained perception to detect threat, how empathy had been sidelined as costly, unreliable. Elias shared how humans learned to survive difference by building tools for translation, how listening became a technology of peace. The garden lights pulsed gently, echoing their exchange, and he sensed a midpoint approaching, a hinge in the narrative neither could avoid. A message arrived then, encrypted and urgent, from a distant sector where a research station had gone dark. Lives were at risk, jurisdiction unclear, politics volatile, and the Empress's eyes met his with a question unspoken. He answered by standing, resolve settling, ready to act where principles would be tested hardest. The journey to the station unfolded quickly, a joint delegation moving through corridors that reconfigured for speed and privacy. Elias reviewed schematics, noting redundancies and failure modes, while the Empress coordinated assets with measured calm. As they traveled, dissent sharpened into concern, voices warning against human involvement, against appearing uncertain before rivals. Elias felt the familiar tension between urgency and legitimacy, knowing the wrong move could fracture fragile trust. At the threshold, alarms flared, and the station's silhouette loomed, dark against the starfield, damage reading as cascading and complex. He proposed an approach that prioritized lives over attribution, intervention over inquiry, and waited for her decision. She chose action, and the order carried a quiet bravery that redefined command. Inside the station, systems faltered unpredictably, and Elias worked shoulder to shoulder with alien engineers, translating across interfaces and cultures. He improvised Slack into rigid protocols, teaching by doing, explaining choices as he made them, inviting correction rather than demanding compliance. The Empress observed, learning the rhythm of collaborative crisis, issuing support without overshadowing competence. A surge threatened the habitat ring, and Elias redirected power manually, taking personal risk to buy time. When the danger passed, gratitude filled the room, not as applause, but as shared breath regained. Elias felt the cost settle into his bones, exhaustion paired with purpose, and he met the Empress's gaze across the control deck. Something had shifted irrevocably, a revelation born of fire and restraint. In the aftermath, questions arrived faster than answers, and the political implications began to surface like debris after a storm. Some praised the decisiveness, others criticized the exposure, and Elias sensed the midpoint turning, the story reframing itself around consequence. The Empress convened a private council, inviting voices that opposed her choice, modeling openness at personal risk. Elias spoke last, not to justify, but to contextualize, tracing how empathy reduced long-term volatility even when it complicated the present. Silence followed, heavy but not hostile, and then agreement emerged, tentative yet real. Policy shifted, not as decree, but as consensus grown from shared experience, and Elias felt the arc bend. They returned to the palace changed, carrying a truth that would demand its due. The palace received them with a quieter gravity than before, as if the walls had learned to listen after witnessing choice under pressure, and Elias felt the weight of consequence settle alongside resolve. Word of the station spread through the court not as rumor but as texture, a subtle shift in posture and tone that followed them through corridors. Support gathered in unexpected places, while resistance sharpened where certainty felt threatened, and Elias understood that the decisive push had begun. The Empress convened a conclave at an hour between cycles, a liminal space where old rules loosened their grip, and invited voices that rarely shared a room. Elias took his place not at her side but within the circle, a deliberate choice that signaled partnership rather than elevation. Eyes tracked him, weighing human audacity against alien tradition, and he met the scrutiny without flinching, grounded in the work already done. The chamber hummed, poised for fracture or fusion. Challenges came framed as concerns for stability, for precedent, for the optics of mercy mistaken as weakness, and Elias listened until the cadence revealed fear beneath argument. He responded with stories from the station, of hands moving together across difference, of risk shared rather than assigned, of systems saved because authority allowed space. The Empress spoke then of stewardship as a living practice, of governance that adapted without erasing its past, and her words braided with his into a shared line. Dissent did not vanish, but it transformed, becoming questions instead of accusations, proposals instead of ultimatums. A vote was called, not to anoint a policy but to authorize a trial period, an experiment measured in trust and outcomes. The measure passed by a narrow margin, and Elias felt the tremor of history choosing a path not guaranteed but promising. The palace lights warmed, acknowledging a threshold crossed. Not all accepted the result, and shadows gathered where influence preferred certainty over learning, coalescing into quiet obstruction. Supply schedules tightened, approvals slowed, and a pattern emerged that threatened to stall progress without open defiance. Elias noticed first, recognizing the human tactic of procedural drag, and brought it to the Empress with evidence rather than suspicion. She received it with calm clarity, neither angry nor naive, and together they mapped responses that preserved dignity while restoring flow. They introduced transparency dashboards visible to all factions, reframing delays as shared problems rather than private leverage. The resistance faltered, exposed by light rather than crushed by force, and some opponents shifted, relieved to step out of shadow. Elias felt the SoulHFY truth sharpen here, that persistence paired with empathy could outlast cunning. As the days pressed on, the palace faced an external test, a coalition maneuver that tested borders and patience with equal pressure. The Empress proposed a risky plan that leaned into the new ethic, inviting joint patrols and shared oversight rather than escalation. Critics warned of vulnerability, of appearing divided, and Elias weighed the cost with her in long nights of quiet calculation. They ran simulations that included human unpredictability as a variable rather than a flaw. building slack into strategy. When the plan launched, it did so transparently, an invitation broadcast with clear terms and safeguards. The coalition hesitated, recalibrated, and then accepted, surprised by an offer that preserved face while reducing risk. Momentum shifted, and the palace breathed easier, knowing the push had held. The cost came later, as costs do, when an opportunistic faction exploited the openness to probe defenses at a peripheral node. Alarms flared, and the Empress's command sharpened, decisive without reverting to fear, and Elias felt the stakes crest. He volunteered for the forward team, knowing the symbolism mattered as much as the outcome, and she consented with a steady gaze. The deployment was swift, a blend of alien precision and human improvisation, and Elias moved through damaged corridors with practiced calm. They stabilized the node under fire, protecting lives while signaling resolve, and the probe withdrew, lesson learned on both sides. Back at the palace, criticism softened, replaced by grudging respect for a doctrine that balanced openness with teeth. Elias carried bruises and fatigue, reminders that ideals demanded bodies as well as words. In the quiet after, the Empress met him in the garden where bioluminescent leaves traced familiar constellations, and the air felt earned. "You took risk for the whole," she said, acknowledgement heavy with meaning, and he nodded, feeling the truth settle. "So did you," he replied, returning the mirror, and the moment held without need for ceremony. They spoke of sacrifice not as loss but as investment, of how legitimacy grew when leaders shared danger. The palace signaled a stabilization across sectors, indicators trending toward trust rather than fear, and Elias felt the arc bend toward endgame. He knew the final test would not be external, but internal, a choice about legacy and form. The garden lights pulsed, anticipating a resolution that would demand clarity. The palace entered a hush that was not silence but readiness, a held breath that carried the weight of decisions ripened by strain and care, and Elias felt the culmination pressed gently at his back. He walked the long curve of the central promenade with the Empress, their steps aligned without effort, the station's slow rotation visible through glass like a reminder of continuity. Word had spread of reforms tested and held, of borders steadied without blood, of a doctrine that proved flexible without fracturing, and expectation followed them like a tide. At the threshold of the throne hall, the Empress paused, not to command but to center, and Elias mirrored the stillness, grounding himself in purpose rather than outcome. When the doors parted, the court was already arranged in a circle. The old hierarchy softened into geometry that invited witness rather than obedience. Elias took his place within that shape, feeling the significance without craving it, ready to stand by the choices already made. The hall's light settled into a neutral warmth, signaling a moment meant to be remembered. The Empress addressed the assembly with clarity that carried no edge, naming the trials endured and the lessons learned without ornament. She spoke of authority as service sharpened by accountability, of strength revealed through restraint, and of a future built by listening across difference. When she invited Elias to speak, it was not as validation but as testimony, and he accepted with a nod that acknowledged shared authorship. He spoke of the station's saved lives, of trust forged under pressure, of how empathy scaled when designed into systems rather than left to chance. He did not promise ease or perfection, only diligence and repair, and the honesty resonated through the room like a tuning fork struck true. Questions followed, fewer than expected, and the answers emerged collaboratively, voices layering into consensus without erasing dissent. A charter was affirmed, provisional yet real, anchoring policy to practice and committing the court to review by outcomes rather than optics. With the decision sealed, the palace shifted, lights brightening along corridors as if acknowledging a stable state achieved. Elias felt relief mingle with responsibility, knowing resolutions were beginnings in disguise, and he turned to the Empress with quiet gratitude. She regarded him not as consort or subject, but as partner, and the recognition carried weight deeper than any title. They withdrew from ceremony into the garden, where familiar constellations glowed across leaves, and the air felt like rain remembered. "I tested you," she said without apology, "and you tested me," and the symmetry pleased him. "Tests are mirrors," he replied, "useful if we're willing to look," and she smiled, accepting the truth as shared ground. The palace hummed softly, a living witness to a covenant shaped by choice. In the days that followed, changes settled into routine, reforms measured and adjusted, opposition engaged rather than silenced. Elias worked alongside councils and crews, translating principles into procedures, listening for friction points that signaled learning rather than failure. The Empress moved with him through these spaces, modeling curiosity at the highest level, making listening visible as leadership. Trust compounded, not dramatically, but steadily, like a bridge strengthened by traffic rather than weakened by it. Messages arrived from distant sectors reporting calmer corridors and fewer probes, proof that restraint paired with resolve altered incentives. Elias allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction, careful not to mistake progress for permanence. He carried the human habit of maintenance into every conversation, a quiet gift learned through loss. On a final evening before the next cycle of travel, they returned to the chamber where masks had first thinned, the flame casting familiar shadows. The Empress set aside regalia, choosing simplicity, and Elias mirrored the gesture, meeting her as he always had, without armor. "You knew me," she said, not seeking praise, and he answered with the truth that had guided him from the start. "I knew the way you listened," he said, "the way rooms changed when you chose patience, and the words felt complete." She reached out, close enough to share warmth, a cultural sign of bond unambiguous and earned. Together they considered the future, not as a script but as a practice to be renewed, attentive and brave. The flame burned steady, reflecting a balance struck and held. When dawn cycle light returned, Elias stood at the viewport, watching stars wheel with measured grace, and felt a belonging that did not erase origin. He was human still, shaped by gravity and grit, carrying empathy as method, persistence as ethic. Behind him, the palace breathed, and the Empress joined him, sharing the view without claiming it. They spoke of journeys ahead and returns promised, of tests yet to come that would demand the same honesty. Elias felt the story settle into legacy, not as triumph alone, but as a pattern others could choose to follow. He turned to her, recognition complete, knowing the soul he had seen would continue to choose listening. The stars kept turning, and the work continued, held by trust.